And now I will get started. So as I mentioned, my name is Mitchell O'Neill. I work with the New York Natural Heritage Program. And today we also have Tom Allgaier, the Invasive Species Coordinator for the New York State Department of Ag and Markets. And we're going to talk about how to identify and report spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven with iMapInvasives. And so I work at the New York Natural Heritage Program. Our mission is to facilitate biodiversity conservation by providing information and expertise on rare species. So our organization as a whole is probably more well known for the rare species work, but I work in the invasive species database where we administer iMapInvasives and work on the Watercraft Inspection Steward program. And the connection there is that invasive species have significant impacts on biodiversity. And so we've broken it up today into, I'm going to give some introduction. Tom is going to then talk about how to identify spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven. And then I'm going to come back and talk about iMapInvasives and how to participate in our grid square effort. And for anyone who's not familiar with spotted lanternfly, Tom's going to talk about this in detail, but just as a brief primer, it's an invasive pest from Asia, feeds on many different plant species, including crop species and native species. There's a huge potential for economic impacts, and also it's sort of a nuisance species, particularly in urban areas. So there's a lot of different reasons to be worried about spotted lanternfly. And so it's really become one of the highest priorities in terms of invasive species in New York State. And so we're really happy to have all of you on this call with us today to learn more about it and how you can help. And so invasive species work in New York State and really anywhere is a huge collaborative effort. So no one organization could possibly tackle all of the issues themselves. So we rely on this really great network of volunteers, community scientists, natural resource professionals, who all take part in monitoring and management efforts. And as someone from iMapInvasives, the main things I think about are contributing data to IMAP, reviewing the data submitted, and utilizing iMapInvasives data. And so this includes invasive plants like tree of heaven, which we'll learn about today, and also invasive animals, including insects like spotted lanternfly. And so a big thank you to all of the organizations we collaborate with. So the PRISMs, state agencies, all sorts of other organizations as well, and all of our volunteers, of course. And so a lot of what we will talk about today kind of started with this innovative effort that we launched last year, a coordinated statewide effort to monitor invasive species, particularly to monitor spotted lanternfly, both with invasive species partners, so professionals, but also volunteers. And so all of you are very essential to this effort. One main role that the general public takes in monitoring invasive species is reporting, contributing data where you find invasive species with photos, and those then get reviewed by iMapInvasives confirmers as well as agency staff in terms of spotted lanternfly. And so we were very impressed with our volunteers last year. In 2021, we had a lot of incoming data for spotted lanternfly and tree of heaven, especially considering it was the first year that we did this. So we're very thankful to everyone who participated. As you can see on that map, the different shades of red show how many spotted lanternfly surveys were conducted. Of course, for pretty much anywhere outside of the New York City area and maybe the southern lower Hudson region, Most of those reports were thankfully not detected, which is what we love to see. But you can see that surveys were conducted in many counties across New York State, in all of the prisms, basically covering all the regions of New York State. And we had 169 grid squares claimed. I'll explain what those grid squares are later. Oh no, sorry, we had more than that claimed, but 169 people actually submitted data for Spotted Lanternfly and Tree of Heaven. And you can see in that table that we got hundreds of records throughout the year. Thankfully, most of the Spotted Lanternfly data was not detected last year. And just to show how much of an increase this was, so before 2021, if you look at just the SLF not detected records, we only had 21 total not detected records. But last year in 2021, we increased that to 675, and most of these records are coming from volunteers. So we are super thankful for our 2021 volunteers. And so this effort has then been relaunched for 2022. The grid square map was cleared out, and then people made new claims. And so far, we already have about 100 grid squares claimed, which is puts us on really good track for the summer. And I'm very impressed with this year's volunteer group as well, because if you look at the map, it's only May, and we already have so many not detected records coming in for Spotted Lanternfly, all the way from Long Island up to northern New York and all the way over to Buffalo. So thank you for everyone who's already joining this project, and we're excited to have more people join. And so that was my brief intro. And so now we'll get into learning more about these species from Tom Allgeier.
Species coordinator here at New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. I just want to tag on to what Mitch was just talking about. This morning when I came in checking my email, there were 38 reports of Spotted Lanternfly from the New York City metro area. Those are still unconfirmed. I have not had time to wade through those yet, but those reports for New York City are even coming in. So thank you to any folks that may be on the call that made those reports or that claimed those grids. So the reports are definitely coming in. We do have hatch and confirmed in the lower Hudson area, and as well as Long Island and New York City. So the nymphs are out and about. So next slide. So New York State Department of Agriculture is the lead agency for the Spotted Lanternfly response, although it is by far not the only agency. There are 9 agencies that make up the New York State Invasive Species Council, and all those agencies contribute, as well as other partners like the PRISMs and iMapInvasives and many, many others, and individuals, citizen scientists as well. But we are the lead agency because Spotted Lanternfly is primarily an agricultural pest. That's really the only reason why it kind of falls in our bucket. So with that, we launched a Spotted Lanternfly page on our department homepage. It can be accessed through this URL. That is not updated. It's periodically updated. It's not updated on a minute-by-minute basis or a day-by-day basis. But lots of information is there, and links to other places where you can get other information. I'll talk about that later. So next page. So Spotted Lanternfly, Lycorma delicata. Spotted Lanternfly is native to China and Southeast Asia, places like Vietnam. It was first discovered in Pennsylvania in 2014. It was a retired natural resource person from the state of Pennsylvania that noticed some odd activity in some other insects. They were stinging insects kind of swarming around, and he smelled this fermented, almost alcohol type smell, and he kind of tracked it down and investigated a little bit to see what this odd occurrence was, and it was coming from what he found was Spotted Lanternfly, and the other insects were attracted to the honeydew. I'll talk about that a little bit. So it was a private citizen, basically a retiree, that found this. So just like yourselves, it's important to have folks out there. The more eyes and ears we have that are trained to kind of hone in on these things, it helps tremendously. So they use their mouth parts to feed on the sap of more than 70 different types of plants. I think the list is much more than 70 at this point. But 7, you get the idea that it's many, many plants. They have piercing, sucking mouth parts. They don't suck out the sap. It's so much as the sap pressure in the plant pushes the sap through the insect. So they prefer tree of heaven, Ailanthus altissima, as their primary host. They produce much better. They produce healthier offspring. They produce more offspring when they feed on tree of heaven. But they can also complete their life cycle using some other native plants like maple and walnut and things like that. They're definitely a pest of apples and grapes and hops, as well as walnuts and maples and other plants. The grape industry is at greatest risk, just because the way they feed and the way the plants react. So, next slide. I mentioned a little bit about their honeydew. Here you can see a picture of someone's deck on their steps. The bottom step has been power washed, and the other 2 steps are black and sticky and gooey. That kind of ties into what Mitch was talking about as far as it being a nuisance pest in urban and suburban areas. Really anywhere it occurs, it's going to rain down honeydew, which is an excrement. It's sugary, sweet, and then black sooty mold will grow on this on sooty mold. It can start to ferment. You see that top right picture there with the masses of adult spotted lanternfly. That frothy substance at the bottom is the honeydew as it starts to ferment. You can also see it here covering some grape leaves. It starts to block the ability of the plant to photosynthesize because it coats the leaf in that black sooty mold, and it just becomes a real nuisance. You can see on this on the bottom right there is someone's post. I believe it was a clothesline. So you probably wouldn't want to be drying your clothes under this and having your clothes covered in honeydew. Not really a ideal situation, but pretty much anything under it: cars, vehicles, kids, toys, anything underneath, picnic tables, benches. It will cover this, cover the surface, and it's just a sticky mess. So, next slide. As far as the agricultural impacts, I mentioned grapes. So our vineyard losses in New York State could be, and nationally, could be tremendous. New York ranks 3rd in grape production. That might come to a surprise to some folks. Everyone thinks of grapes. I think of California, which we are dwarfed by California, and we come in a close 3rd. Past Pennsylvania. There's quite a bit of wine, table grape, and juice grapes. Juice grapes are primarily in the western part of the state. So that's a big potential threat to, or not potential anymore because it's here in New York State, but it's a big threat to our agricultural crops such as grapes. Orchards that produce apples and stone fruit, again, it's a threat to those as well. They are a little bit easier, a little bit better prepared to not so much defend, but adapt to the feeding practices of the spotted lanternfly. But the coating of the honeydew is still, it's going to affect the crop because it's going to diminish the plant's ability to photosynthesize. New York State has been promoting hops, local hop growing for a lot of local breweries, things like that, for the last several years. And of course, hops is another host plant for spotted lanternfly. Environmental impacts as well, which are also important. They could affect some forest and forest products such as maple and walnut, things like that. So, next page. So where is it? Right now, as far as we know, this map is current and up to date as of yesterday. When I double checked, you could see it started in Berks County, Pennsylvania, which is kind of like the central eastern part of Pennsylvania. And as you can see, it's kind of spiderwebbed out from there, spilling over into the neighboring states. In New York State, it's in all 5 New York City boroughs or counties. It's also in Tompkins, Orange, Rockland, Ulster, Broome, Westchester, Nassau, and Suffolk. Now, that does not mean the entire county is infested. Take Tompkins County, for instance. It's a very small area in Ithaca. We believe we have eliminated it from that site. through treatments and monitoring and survey. So just because the county is listed doesn't necessarily mean the entire county is infested. On the other end of that spectrum would be Richmond County, which is Staten Island. Every kilometer grid that we have surveyed in Staten Island as of 2020, and it's only gotten worse, has been positive for Spider-Lanternfly. So we kind of run the gamut. So don't let the blue areas think that everything in that area is covered. It's not. So next page. So the emergence prediction, as I mentioned briefly, that emergence has occurred here in New York State. So this emergence map is a few days old. I believe this, I think it's dated on here. Nope, I don't see the date. So this is about a week old. But you can see most of New York State has up to 50% emergence predicted, especially in the lower Hudson Valley and Long Island, New York City, which is where we're finding them. So that this is a little lag time, but it's pretty accurate. We expect to find some areas possibly in Binghamton where we had some detections last year. Those areas will probably become positive, confirmed for emergence very soon. The big concern is the areas where we don't know it is. So it can pop up anywhere. It's unlikely to be in the Adirondacks because it's unlikely to reach its sexual maturity in most of those areas. But on the periphery of the Adirondacks and some microclimates, that might be possible. And that information collected from this survey helps us fine-tune this prediction mapping. So thank you. Next page. As I mentioned, New York City reports are coming in. These came in last week. The one on the left there is from a rooftop patio that was on the 34th or 38th, I think it was 38th floor on the west side of Manhattan, and you can see 3 tiny little nymphs crawling around. So there must have been an egg mass up high on the building. They've hatched out. Based on the size, they're very tick-like when they first hatch. The first instar is very small. I've blown up and kind of expanded the one on the right. It looks a little bit bigger than reality what it is. I wish I had something in there like a pencil or a dime or something. It's quite small, but you can see those distinctive little white markings on the back. So you wouldn't see a tick with multiple white dots like that. So it's easy to tell from a tick that way, but the size is about the same size as a tick when they first emerge. So next page. On Long Island and the Hudson Valley, we're also seeing emergence. So these pictures came in yesterday morning. The one on the left there is from Newburgh, and the one on the right there is from, the one on the left is from Highland. The one on the right is from Bohemia. You can see that there must be an egg mass real nearby because those first instar nymphs have not started to disperse yet. Once they hatch, the first instars disperse themselves into the environment, and they're very, very difficult to find just because they are generalist feeders at that point, and they're so tiny. When they first hatch, they kind of cluster together like you can see on the photo on the right. But once they start to disperse, as you can see on the left, they're much harder to detect in the environment. So as they get larger, they're easier to detect. So next page. The life cycle. So currently we're in this kind of bottom center. The nymphs are beginning to emerge. What happens then is they'll metamorphosize and they'll shed their exoskeleton 3 times. The 4th time that they do that, well, let me back up. So they'll shed their exoskeleton 3 times and they'll remain basically the same, just slightly larger versions of themselves, but they'll be black with white dots. Then the next nymph stage will start to have these little red dots on their wing pads, and they're much easier to spot in the environment. By that point, they're about the size of a dime, and with that bright red wing pad coloring, they're easy to spot. And then later in the summer, towards July, the adults will start to emerge as it metamorphosizes for the final time and becomes an adult. And thanks for thank you, appreciate that. And then late in the summer, really into the fall, they'll start to mate. And then once they've mated, really October through December, they will start laying their eggs. I'll get into that a little bit more detail in a little bit. But the eggs can be covered or uncovered or partially covered, as you can see in these photos here. They don't look so much like spongy moth. It looks almost like putty or clay or mud. At first, they can be glossy. At first, they're white. And within a few hours or day, they start to turn tan and brown. So there's variability in color and texture. They don't necessarily always stay smooth like it appears in this photo. So it's a little tricky that way because you can't say the egg masses look like this because they can look like this, or that. You know, there's a little bit of variability there, but I'll give some better examples of that in a little bit. So next page. Just another graphic here. So the life stage we're in right now is kind of boxed out in yellow, kind of the end of the egg stages, although we can still see those hatching up until June, although June's just right around the corner. Right now we're looking at first, maybe some possible second instars. If you look at the little pictures there on the left side, the second one down is that first instar nymph. It looks really tiny. So what it's perched on there is a spruce needle. So it gives you an idea for size. They are very, very tiny. So you can see it perched there getting ready to jump off. They are leaf hoppers, so it's getting ready to hop off that spruce needle. So if you can picture a spruce tree and how small the needles are, that gives you an idea of scale for that insect. And there's some of the eggs on the underside of a branch, completely covered. So we can find basically those two life stages at this point. But, you know, I'm sure that once you go through this training and this webinar and you're out there looking for spotted lanternfly, you know, we ask you to do it at multiple seasons. So you later on in the year, you could possibly find the other life stages, you know, the later instar nymphs and then also the adults. But for today, we're just going to concentrate mostly on the eggs and the early nymphs. So next page. So the eggs, you know, I don't know if you could see this. This is an ailanthus tree. It's got that cantaloupe-type bark. If you look closely in the center there, you can see a spot that's a little bit different, a little off color. Even the top part is still a little bit white. That's probably a very freshly laid egg mass. It's not glossy as the earlier picture. If you click one more time, Mitch, please. It kind of highlights it. And then if you go toggle back, sorry. So you can, and then back again. So you can spot that, you know, once you get kind of train your eyes to look for it, you know, it blends in, it's very easily camouflaged. But once you kind of get trained to spotting them, it becomes easier. So, but it's very easy to miss these. And this one's out in the open, nice clear lighting, bright lighting and nice clear view. If they're tucked under things, which they often are, it becomes more problematic to spot the egg masses. So next page, please. As I mentioned, they like to lay in protected areas. So here's a little some cat facing on a branch, on a tree trunk rather, where it looks like either there was some sort of wound, either a branch had broken off, or maybe there was something that had banged up against the tree and it started producing wound wood, and the bark's curling over. So looking straight at the tree trunk, you wouldn't see the egg mass, but from the side, you can see where the bark is kind of making that little protected shelter, and then on the right, you can really see the egg mass tucked under that bark. And that's just a zoomed in version. But from the side, it just looks like tree bark, maybe a piece of dirt, you know, up underneath there, maybe some mud from a mud dauber or something like that. But when you zoom in, you can see that it's clearly a spotted lanternfly egg mass. So those protected areas are really key to hone in on when you're looking. So, next page. Here's a good example of, you know, the female laying some eggs, again, on ailanthus. Got that cantaloupe-like skin. So there's a completely covered egg mass on the upper left, and then the adult, who's probably laying more eggs or just been disturbed as she was laying those uncovered eggs on the right. Typically, that's not a full egg mass. Anywhere from 40 to 70 eggs per egg mass is average, is common. And then, as I mentioned, they can be covered or uncovered, depending on you know, really on anything, but probably about 50-50 chance that they'll be covered. So next page. They do like protected areas, as I mentioned, so you can see this this rim and tire. You know, you lift it up, and underneath there's all these egg masses, you know, and they blend in so well. It's very difficult to spot them. and it blends right in. It looks like part of the rusty metal or just some mud on the tire, maybe a little splotch or something. But these are all egg masses in a under that rim that was laying on the ground, protected site. Some of the variability there in the center left side, you can see the protective covering on the egg mass is starting to dry out. It looks almost like more like mud at that point, and it's a partially uncovered egg mass next to it. What's interesting to note between those egg masses or eggs on that center egg mass and the one on the bottom is that the one on the bottom have already started hatching out. You can see those little slits. It looks almost like an oval or a linear slit in the eggs. Those have actually begun to hatch out. They haven't all hatched out, but they're definitely hatching out. So you can tell whether it's a new set of eggs, which will look like the ones in the center right, and then it looks like they have a little pull tab. And then when they've hatched out, that little pull tab is absent, and the center part has that little slit. So you can tell whether they're old eggs or new eggs. At this point, most of the eggs are starting to hatch, but you may still come across some viable current eggs. So next page. They like rusty metal. I don't know if I mentioned that. They like protected areas. So this drum, the ribs on this drum, metal drum here, are all quite rusty, and that little lip provides a little bit of a protected area. Both ribs on that drum have egg masses under them, but you're very easily notice the ones on the bottom, but the one on that top, are a little bit harder to notice. So if you're standing above it, a typical average, adult is going to be looking down at that. You wouldn't even see those egg masses unless you stood back. So it really takes a keen eye sometimes. They do have a tendency to congregate. Once they start laying eggs in a spot, their others are attracted to lay eggs in that same spot. And when they get kind of, all the prime real estate is taken up, they'll kind of go next door and they start to spread out. And that's really what you're seeing here on this drum, that type of behavior, where they start laying in the protected area and then they kind of spill over. But they do like rusty metal. If there's a tree versus a rusty piece of rusty metal, they will be on the rusty metal. But they can lay eggs on any flat surface outside. So if grandma is out there sitting in her rocker and she's not moving, they will lay eggs on grandma. Anything flat, anything outside, anything exposed to the environment is prime egg-laying territory for Spider-Lanternfly. And that's our fear, is that those materials, be it a trailer or a piece of equipment, some tools, camping gear, hunting gear, recreational equipment, gets moved from one site to another. That's the easiest way to spread eggs. And here's another good example of the egg masses, covered versus uncovered. The uncovered ones are a little bit easier to spot, but this appears like it could possibly be either, well, I see lenticels. I can't really tell what the plant is. It could be a cherry, it could be a birch, it could also be bittersweet vine. But you can see the horizontal lenticels, which is a part of the plant, but the egg masses, are always going to be vertical. On a tree, they have a tendency to go up and down. Even on the barrel there, you can see the egg masses have a tendency to be vertical. But the covered egg mass is a little bit harder to spot. It blends in, where the exposed ones are a little bit easier to spot. So just some other tips to look for, that, when you're looking at plants that have lenticels, if they're going horizontal, don't panic. And they're usually spaced out like they are in this plant, where the eggs are actually clustered and stacked, row upon row, stack upon stack. So if you see just a little dots on the tree, don't panic. If they're all lined up in neat rows, that's the time to take a second look. So next page. Rusty metal again. Did I mention rusty metal? I think I mentioned rusty metal, because they like to lay on rusty metal. So this tractor trailer, railroad tracks, not rusty metal, but a piece of recreation equipment, a little camp chair that was left outside, laying down on the ground. When it was lifted up, these egg masses were found. The dogs from the Lower Hudson Prism, from the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference, were able to detect the egg mass on the underside of this railroad track. Very difficult spot for humans to survey. even with inspectional mirrors. The dogs are much more effective in situations like that. But the back end of this tractor trailer on this, light housing, a protective piece of metal to protect those lights. The top side, no eggs whatsoever. The underside, as you can see, there's probably a couple dozen egg masses right there. So, next page. So the take-home messages, as far as spotted lanternfly goes, and this current season that we're in now, is keep looking for egg masses. They definitely are still out there. The early nymphs, the black ones with the white spots, whether it's the first, second, or third instar, they just get a little bit bigger each time, but they start off tick size, and they kind of get up towards about the size of a dime. They're hard to spot right now, but they get easier to spot as they get older. So you should be looking for those now. Any flat protected areas, think under and behind. Are they under that fence? The rail on that fence? Are they behind? On the barrel? Are they behind the back side of it? Those are the places to really check. Behind the bark, things like that. So when you're looking at flat protected areas, think under and behind. Well, as I mentioned several times, I think I got the point across. I hope I did. They like rusty metal. And the really important thing is negative is good. So if you're out there surveying and you're not finding it, that's great. That's great data to report because we know somebody has looked there, and we know that we can concentrate our efforts someplace else. So negative is not always bad. When it comes to survey, negative is good. I used to joke around when I was on the Asian longhorn beetle program that I didn't get paid to find Asian longhorn beetle. I get paid to not find it. Negative survey is good. We did not want to find it, but if we wanted to look for it, but we did not want to find it. If that's what I'm trying to say. So very much the same with this pest. We want to look for it. We don't want to find it, but we do want to look for it. If it is found, we need to report that. But negative data is always a good thing. So I hope I'm not going too fast. So next page.
Thanks so much, Tom. I was just going to pause for 1 second. Thank you so much for teaching us all about spotted lanternfly and how to identify these different life stages. I did want to remind everyone that there is a Q&A option. So if you have any questions, please enter those into the Q&A. And so next, Tom is going to talk about Tree of Heaven. Any questions that come in about spotted lanternfly or Tree of Heaven, if we have time, we can go over maybe 2 or 3 at the end of Tom's training on Tree of Heaven before we get into the IMAP related stuff. So I'll go to the next slide and then hand it back over to Tom.
Thanks, Mitch. I needed a little break there. Appreciate that. Usually I don't do both segments, but we had some staffing changes here, and I'm doing double duty today. So identification of Tree of Heaven, which is also another invasive species, also native to Asia. As I mentioned earlier, it's the primary host, not the only host. It's the preferred host. When it completes its life cycle on Atlantis, it produces better, stronger, healthier offspring, and it produces more and more viable eggs. So it's even though it's not the only host, but it's the one we still want to key in on just because of that. It's very significant to this pest. So next page. So it was brought here to North America in 1748 as a horticultural plant. Early plantings were mostly in the Pennsylvania area, particularly at one arboretum and surrounding areas. And people that knew the people from that arboretum, they got these special new plants from Asia. One reason it was brought in, it was brought in as a host for a silk moth species. The intent very much with spongy moth. Silk moths were a valuable commodity. Silk was a very valuable commodity, and silk moth farming or production was highly sought after. So hosts for these silk moths were brought in hopes of producing silk here in the U.S. Western settlers would take these plants with them. They would settle them in their towns throughout the West. Some of them still exist, but they really don't like the drier climates. They really love what we have here in the Northeast. But some of the far western states, you find less and less tree of heaven, just because it's had less time to get there, and also because the climate is a little less suitable. Although some of the northwest, northern central western states there, say Chicago, Indiana, Michigan, they have very similar climate to us, and it does quite like that climate. When you start getting into the drier, more arid climates, it's hard to find. It was also featured as the tree in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. So I guess it has some fame and notoriety. Although it is a weed species, it's an invasive species. It will grow anywhere, particularly in urban environments. So, next page. As I mentioned, in urban environments, here you can see a little, very thin strip between that building and the parking lot. It probably doesn't get a whole lot of water there, but it's filled with tree heaven. They're very persistent at coming up through the cracks in concrete, and they love disturbed soils, things like that. Their native range, as I mentioned, is China and Taiwan. They tolerate very poor soils. They grow well in urban and suburban environments. Many different habitats, maybe different soil types. They just need an open area, and they will grow very aggressively. And they're drought tolerant once they're established. They impact natives by crowding them out with their dense foliage and dense shade. They have allelopathic compounds very similar to black walnut, so they kind of poison their neighbors. Once they start growing, they release these allelopathic compounds into the soil, and it prohibits other seeds from growing, or most other seeds. Some things are kind of tolerant of that. So it changes the nutrient cycling in the soil. And it can also damage buildings and sidewalks and things like that with their root sprouts. It will grow up through concrete, very much like Phragmites, where it'll push up through concrete. These will do the same. They'll crack concrete, crack sidewalks, crack foundations. So it could be a structural nuisance as well. But as I mentioned earlier, it's the preferred host for Spider-Lanternfly. They've co-evolved, and that whatever reason, it's its favorite food, basically. So, next page. So the growth form, often you'll find them growing in colonies or clumps. You can see this winter picture here, this colony of mature tree of heaven. And then also you can find that, the new seedlings and new sprouts coming up from rootlets. So you can find single trees or you can find colonies. Very often, if it's a well-established site, you'll have colonies, and they'll be clones. They'll share root systems. They'll be root grafted together. The common name comes from its very fast growth as it grows towards heaven very quickly. They can grow several feet in 1 year. So. They can also reach somewhere between 55 and 80 feet. 80 feet is pretty tall for an ailanthus tree. They're somewhat weak-wooded. So in heavy storms, they have a tendency to break branches and things like that. So next page. One telltale sign. So talk about their leaf arrangement. So they have their leaf arrangement is opposite on pinnate leaves. So they have compound leaves that are pinnate. So they have very small, narrow leaflets on a single leaf. They come off of a central petiole, which you can see there. The base of the petiole is kind of that bright red. But the base of each leaflet has this little notch, this little thumb, this little bump. And you don't get that with the lookalikes. So where it's circled here, you see that extra little bump in the base of the leaflet where it attaches to the petiole. That's a common way to tell ailanthus from other lookalikes. So just like all trees, when you're especially in winter ID, you don't have leaves to look at. Leaf arrangement, whether it's alternate, opposite, or world, is a great way to key in and ID plants. Most things in the environment, most trees at least, are alternate, but there are a few that are opposite, so you can rule those out pretty easily. So next page. So it's a pinnate leaf. As I mentioned, there are leaflets on a central petiole. The leaflet at the tip will be single, not double, and the number of leaflets per leaf is variable. So you can't necessarily count the leaflets to determine if this is or is not tree of heaven, because there is some variability there. But they are opposite on the petiole. So next page. Again, that you can see that little notch in the leaf there. Sometimes it's one, sometimes it's two. There's a little bit of variability there, but the rest of the margin is smooth. So it comes up off the petiole, and then and that one little notch, that one little bump, and then the rest of it is smooth along the edge. It has a very blunt base. And there, if you look very closely, which you can't really see in this photo, but there are glandular dots on the underside at the base of the petiole there. So next page. The seeds, which are samaras, which are similar to ash and maple, they produce samaras. It's a single samara, very much like an ash tree. There's a little bit of variability in color. They're kind of pretty looking, actually, when they start hanging. But it's very, very easy to ID these when they're in flower, and also when they have the seeds hanging. Of course, only the females will have seeds, and they're dioecious, so they're male and female trees. So just because it doesn't have the seed heads doesn't mean it's not an ailanthus tree. It could just be a male ailanthus. When they're dried later in the season, they kind of turn brown, as in the center there. When they first emerge, they're green and very lush looking. And you can see that the seed is actually centered kind of towards the center, maybe the bottom third of the samara. It's a single samara, like an ash tree, not like a maple tree where it has a double samara. And then in flower there, you can see it kind of the red flowering, towards the late flowering stage, and then when the samaras start to begin, it's quite like a reddish pink, and that color starts to fade, and then you come full circle to the fall when it's brown again. So next page. So the pith, the center part of the stem is another ID key point. So if you break off a small twig, and the center part is somewhat hollow, where the center is very soft, almost like styrofoam-like in the center. That's the pith. Not all plants have soft pith, but the tree of heaven does have soft pith. The smell is like, I've been told it's like burnt peanut butter. To me, it doesn't. I've never smelled burnt peanut butter before. Sorry, folks. I'm trying to. So I've never smelled burnt peanut butter before, but it does have an acrid, horrible smell. It's not a good smell. It's very putrid. It's disgusting. It's a brownish tan in color. I mentioned that. I'll explain why in a minute. So next page. So it has smooth bark. I think I mentioned that. Think about like what a cantaloupe looks like. That has that texture to it. Even as the trees get older, they have this kind of rippled, somewhat smooth bark to them. It's not very furrowed like you would get with an oak or a cherry, and it's not smooth like a birch. It's kind of in between. The very young trees are very smooth. They don't start to develop this cantaloupe type skin until they get a few inches in diameter. So next page. So I mentioned the pith. So if you look at the page on the right, the sumac twig, sumac they also have compound leaves with leaflets, and it's often confused with tree of heaven. Sumac, however, when you break the little twigs, they also have pith, but the pith is white. So if you break a twig and it's got tannish brownish pith, it's tree of heaven. If you break a twig and it's got white pith, It's probably sumac. But you can also see here that you can submit photos in IMAP, photos of the twigs in IMAP. That will also help us determine if this is, tree of heaven or another plant. It's smooth gray, kind of like a chestnut brown in color typically. The leaf scar, which you can see underneath of that bud, is kind of like, it's somewhat heart-shaped with the bud in the center of the heart there. And the bud is always above, not below. And it has little vascular dots, which you really can't see, but the vascular dots kind of ring around the edge of the heart shape. When you look at the other twigs for comparison, things that might look like it because they have compound leaves, like the walnut or the sumac or the horse chestnut, the twigs look very different. The tree of heaven has this very blunt leaf scar at the end with a small little bud. The walnut has small, somewhat fuzzy buds, where the sumac and the horse chestnut look very different. The horse chestnut has a very large leaf bud at the end that's typically very sticky, where the sumac is, it's almost like, it's not round so much as like flat-sided, triangular type twig. It has very flat sides to it versus the very round tree of heaven twig. All right, next page. Again, the sumac I mentioned about the compound leaf, and the tree of heaven often has a reddish hue to the base of the leaf of the petiole rather. So here they are side by side. They look very, very similar, but that little notch in the leaflet and at the base of the leaflet is always a good telltale sign, where the sumac will never have that little notch. The sumac leaves are also more oval, where the tree of heaven leaflets are more tapered. The flower seed heads on the sumac are quite large and chunky. Staghorn sumac gets its common name because it looks like a staghorn. It's quite distinctive. But they have very large seed heads, about the size of your hand. Typically, they're reddish or reddish-brown. And again, you can see that flat-sided, kind of twisted, almost triangular type twig for the sumac. And on the right, you can see a sumac growing right below a tree of heaven. Sumac is typically a smaller understory tree or shrub, where a tree of heaven can get quite large, as I mentioned, to 80 feet. Doesn't mean that every tree of heaven is 80 feet. You can have one that's 4 foot tall growing next to a 15-foot sumac, and the roles, size roles can be reversed. But typically, sumac will be grown, more of a shrub, and tree of heaven will be more of a tree. But that picture on the right gives you a little bit of idea of scale. So, next page. Another lookalike is a black walnut. We talked a little bit about the buds. How they have these small, slightly fuzzy-looking buds, and the leaf scars are not leaf-shaped or not heart-shaped. So you can see the leaf scar there in the center right, center top, and then also the nuts. So the seeds look extremely different than sumac, and also they certainly don't look like samaras. The fresh green seeds are almost like the size of a little cutie tangelo, little orange. They're about the same size and texture, kind of soft. I wouldn't recommend picking them up with your hands. Your hands will get dyed brown. There's a dye that persists in the seeds on the walnut that will turn your hands brown. But the seeds are quite large. When the mesocarp starts to dry out, they can be black, as you can see in the kind of the back part of that bottom photo. If that mesocarp fluffs off, flakes off, you can see the very furrowed nuts. Sometimes you'll find the nuts broken open, or squirrels have eaten the nuts laying underneath the tree. It's another way to ID them. So, if you find nuts laying around underneath of it, it might be a black walnut, not an ailanthus tree. Again, the pinnate compound leaf here, but you can see that the black walnut is alternate, where the pinnate leaf on the tree of heaven is opposite. So that's a telltale sign that it's not tree of heaven. So next page. Another lookalike is ash. Ash also has a compound leaf with pinnate leaflets. Typically, there aren't as many leaflets per petiole. They're a little bit more spaced out, but they are opposite. So you could see how the tree of heaven is much longer petiole, many more leaflets. But again, there's that notch at the leaflet base. That's always going to be a telltale sign. The underside of an ash is very light colored, typically. So that's another way to distinguish the ash from the tree of heaven. Next page. The samaras on ash, as I mentioned, are single samaras, very much like tree of heaven. But here's a side-by-side comparison. The top on the left is the ash, top on the right is tree of heaven. Looking up from the ground, they look very similar. They're clustered samaras. They change in color. The tree of heaven ones are a little bit thicker, a little bit wider. The ash samaras are a little bit thinner. But when you look up close, you can see that the ash seed is actually at the base of the petiole for the samara, where the samaras for the tree of heaven, the seed is in the center, maybe off center towards the tip. So if the actual seed on the samara is at the tip, where the growing part is, where the petiole is, it's ash. If it's towards the center or more towards the tip of the leaf, it's tree of heaven. So when you're looking up, sometimes it's a little hard to distinguish from the ground if that cluster of single samaras is tree of heaven or ash. But when you look at the individual samaras, it's very easy to tell. And they're about the same length. They're about 1.5 inches, 2 inches long. So, all right, next page. So the take-home message for tree of heaven: check your trees, whether they're tree of heaven, maple, ash, walnut, whatever you have. Check your trees. Tree of heaven is the preferred host, but it's just one of many host plants. So, tree of heaven is a good place to start. If you don't have tree of heaven or you can't find any tree of heaven, that's fine too. Look at your other trees. That's really the important part. If we're out there looking, we're not going to find it if we're not out there looking. So, thank you. That's what I got. I think there's one more after that, maybe. Yes. So additional information, as I mentioned when I first started, we have our website that I mentioned at Ag and Market. So that's a link to our website with the current information. But also Cornell IPM has a wonderful Spider-Lanternfly webpage with some treatment options. The map that I showed earlier, they house that map on their site, so they keep that up to date. There's a lot more information there than we have on our website. And I'm available as a resource as well. You can always email me, reach out, and I can certainly help you. If I don't know the answer, I can direct you to someone who does. So I think that's all I had. Right?
Thanks
Rich?
so much, Tom.
Is that the last one?
Yes.
Yep. Okay.
So thank you so much, Tom, for doing both the Spider-Lanternfly and the Tree of Heaven. And I know I learned a lot. I hope our participants did too. I don't see any questions yet, but everyone feel free to put questions in the Q&A, and Tom can look at those as I do my presentation, and we could also go over some at the end. So if you have any questions about Spider-Lanternfly or Tree of Heaven, please feel free to put those in the Q&A.
I'm glad you qualified that it was questions about Tree of Heaven or Spider-Lanternfly, because I did not want to field any questions about herd or depth. Nope.
Okay, so thanks so much, everyone. So now I'll go on to the Imap Invasives section as the last part of the webinar. So for anyone new to Imap, it's the centralized invasive species database to support PRISMs, state agencies, and other partners working on invasive species issues. So you can run reports, look at species distributions. You can, there are email alerts that people can set up. So if you report Spider-Lanternfly, Tom will get an email so we can check it. You can also track control efforts and results. But mainly today, we'll be talking about how to create an account and how to report. So there are several different types of data that exist in iMapInvasives. So presence, not detected, treatment. So Tom was mentioning how not detected data is always good. So that's definitely something I'll talk about. And we'll mostly talk about the presence and the not detected today. And for presence records, we have different types. So confirmed records are records where someone has reviewed the record. So one of our confirmers, for instance, maybe you took a picture of Tree of Heaven of really close up on the leaf, and our confirmers were able to verify that it's Tree of Heaven, then the record becomes confirmed. Unconfirmed records are still awaiting that confirmation. And we also wanted to note that there is some data that's not immediately viewable by the public. So one example is when Spider-Lanternfly records first come in, they're unconfirmed and they are not viewable by the public yet. But once they're confirmed, they are then viewable by the public. So you might submit a record. If you find Spider-Lanternfly, you might submit a record. You won't actually see it on our map until it's been reviewed and confirmed. And just to illustrate that a little bit more, volunteers enter Tree of Heaven records. They go in as unconfirmed. Email alerts go out to our confirmers, and then they review these records and set them to confirmed when they are verifiable. For Spotted Lanternfly, that one's a little bit different. So the email alerts go to Ag and Markets, and they review those and set those to confirmed. At which point those email alerts can go out to anyone who sets up those alerts. And so now I will talk a little bit how to use iMapInvasives, but within the context of this volunteer project. I also just wanted to explain where this volunteer project came from. So it really came from this need. We need more eyes on the ground. We need help monitoring spotted lanternfly. And we also realized that we need the data in a centralized database where Ag and Markets can review reports so that we can have a really organized view of the distribution of spotted lanternfly in real time, because the distribution is always changing. And one thing that really drove us to do this grid square sign up aspect was that we want to direct volunteers' efforts to the locations that will best complement statewide efforts already underway. So essentially, we're trying to spread out our efforts across space. So Ag and Markets and Prisms are doing spotted lanternfly survey work and management work. And so we want to direct volunteer efforts to the areas that are not covered yet and the areas that have the highest risk. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that soon. But essentially what it looks like to participate in this volunteer project is all of our volunteers have to set up an IMAP account. Then they can go into our grid square map and select a grid square to survey. And this is not a forever commitment. You're not forever tied down to that grid square. It's just an expectation that you'll conduct surveys in 2022 in that grid square. Step 3 would be prepping for surveys in your square. So making sure you know how to report to IMAP, picking out some places to check within your grid square. And then step 4 is, of course, actually doing those surveys for spotted lanternfly and Tree of Heaven. And what we are bringing in this year is this idea of survey seasons. So like Tom mentioned earlier, we do want people to go out and check a couple times throughout the year. And so what we've done this year to try to make that more concrete is we've divided up the year into these 4 different seasons. So spring, early summer, late summer, and fall, where we want people to go out and conduct a survey in their grid square, particularly looking for the life stages that are currently active. So the goal is for surveys. That's what people can aspire to, but it's not, it's totally fine. Like maybe you're going on vacation during one of those time blocks and you just can't get out. If you miss one of these survey seasons, that's not a problem. We just really want to try to encourage people to go out multiple times during this year. And so next, I'm going to talk a little bit more about IMAP. So you'll see in step 1, it was actually to set up an IMAP account. And I wanted to clarify before getting into that, there are a couple different components of IMAP, and in particular, the most commonly used are the online web application and the mobile app. So most of your reporting, for example, will be through the mobile app. That's what you would use if you want to report a presence or not detected. But to create your account, you do that online. So I'm going to start by talking about the online application, which is also where you can access the whole database, view distributions of invasive species, etc. So if you don't have an account, go to our homepage at nyimapinvasives.org and click login. And that will bring you to this login page. And you can either enter in your information if you already have an account. You might have to use the forgot password tool if you haven't signed in a long time. And if you don't have an account yet, you can use the sign up box. And after you so you just enter your information and select New York for your jurisdiction, and check for an email from imap@natureserve.org, which will have the link to activate your email by accepting our user agreement. And if anyone gets stuck in this process at all, please feel free to email us at imapinvasives@dec.my.gov, and I'll list that email at the end as well. But if you have an account, you can log in, and this is the sort of screen you'll look at. And so there's all sorts of stuff you can do. You can go into filter records and enter in something like Tree of Heaven to see where those records are. There's navigation tools on the left-hand side. You can turn layers on and off on the right-hand side. But if that's overwhelming or maybe not your main interest, you don't have to use the online version to participate in this project. You can just create your account and then go to the app, which is much more simple, and I'll talk about that later. But one thing you will need in the online interface is to grab your person ID. And because you'll need that to sign up for a grid square. That's how we kind of link you and your IMAP account to a grid square that you claim. And so in the main menu, you would just select your account and see your person ID. But we have more information available on guiding you through how to do that as well. And I'll show you where that is. So that's step 1, creating an account. Step 2 was to select your grid square to survey. So we have this map on our website at nyimapinvasives.org/SLF. And Ag and Markets, Parks, Prisms, MINHP, and other partners helped us select 1 kilometer grid squares across the state where volunteer survey efforts would be most helpful to complement statewide efforts. So the areas where we really need volunteer help. And so there's a couple of different categories that you'd see on the map. So you can log into you can open up the map, you can enter in your town, or you can zoom in, and you'll see these colored grid squares. And so those grid squares are the locations that you can claim as your survey location. And so the highest priority ones, which will pop up first, are those reddish orange focus area grid squares. And so we encourage people to check out those first. If there are any of those that you're interested in surveying, we encourage you to claim them. But if maybe there's none near you or something, you could look at the other grid squares available as well. So those yellow ones were grid squares picked specifically by Prism staff. So those are really good places to survey. And then we also have the purple and blue grid squares, which are locations where Tree of Heaven is already known. So that's a good place to check for Spider-Lanternfly. Or the blue grid squares, which are places where we know there's some public access land, which makes it easier to survey for volunteers. And I do also want to note, like maybe there's a park or something, or your own backyard that you want to survey and it's not on the grid square, that is totally okay. You can still definitely participate. So you would just skip the part where you select a grid square and you would just do the rest of the volunteer project. So you would conduct your Spider-Lanternfly and Tree of Heaven surveys and then report whether or not you found them. So it'd be pretty much the same idea, except no grid square. And so on that map, the way to claim a grid square is essentially you click on the grid square you want and you follow this claim this grid square link, and that'll bring you to a form where you basically just enter your IMAP person ID, which I talked about a second ago, your name, and your email. And so once you have your grid square, oh, and I should also mention, the reason I'm not going through this in much detail is because if you go to our website at nyimapinvasives.org/SLF, I'll just show it briefly. If you go down to the grid square map, there's a lot of instructions on how to use the different functionality of the grid square map, as well as this tutorial you can click on, which does a quick run through of how to use the map and pick a grid square. So I won't go through that sort of detail now. And while I'm here, I'll also just mention I'm covering a lot of stuff right now. It is also laid out on this website that you can refer to whenever you need it. But back in my PowerPoint, I'll go on to step 3. So prepping for surveying in your square. So one of the big things here is plan how you will actually do your reporting to IMapInvasives. And it's a really good idea to try to get a handle on that before you go out and survey. So maybe a week before, try to enter a fake species record in IMAP just to test it out and make sure you know how it works so that it goes smoothly when you're out in the field. So on this slide, I'm listing a couple of the different options you can use to report to IMAP. For example, IMAP mobile app is definitely the most popular one, which I'll direct you all to. But if you don't have a smartphone, you could use the IMAP online interface to go in online and indicate where you have done your surveys. And if you're doing advanced surveys, you could do the survey 1, 2, 3. But really, most of you, I'll direct to the IMAP mobile app. It's ideal for quick data entry while you're out in the field, for that quick, simple data collection that we're looking for in this project. And so this mobile app is in our app store at iMapInvasives. You search iMapInvasives in your store, Google Play or the App Store. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I think many of you might be familiar, but I'll show you where you can find more information and go through the whole process. But essentially, it's a 3-step process where when you have internet, either you're at home or in your office, you would download the app and set up your account on the app and everything. And then you're good to go and record invasive species out in the field. So you could go out onto a trail, maybe where your grid square is, and you don't have internet connection, but that's okay. So you can report observations and they'll be stored on your phone. But an important third step is to remember to upload those records to IMAP once you're back in internet connection. So it's kind of that 3-step process of setup first, then go out and do your observations, and then upload those all to IMAP. And one thing I always like to mention is how important good photos are. So for example, on the left, these photos, you can probably, you might recognize the one on the right. I think that might be a screenshot from one of Tom's photos. So you can probably tell that these are Tree of Heaven, but you do kind of have to squint at it a little bit for a really clear picture. You can see on the right, it's much more clear, and it'll be much more easy for our confirmers to look at that picture and easily tell that there's this heart-shaped scar with the bud in the middle, and it's very clearly a Tree of Heaven. So we always recommend that you try to get it close up, and try to get the camera focused. And since I just kind of blew through that, I wanted to note that there's that SLF webpage, nyimappinvasives.org/SLF, where we have information that guides you through that process. For example, we have a very quick tutorial of how to submit an IMAP record. And we also have some more general training resources on our training page. So there's a lot of resources if you find yourself stuck. And of course, you can always email us. And that's where that tutorial on how to use the app is on the SLF website. And so step 4 is actually conducting those surveys. So essentially, like, you'll have your claimed grid square, but of course you can't cover that entire 1 kilometer square. That's a lot of space. You might not have access to all of that area. Maybe some aren't ideal for going out and surveying. So we encourage you to just look within that grid square on the map and try to pick out a couple spaces or even just one spot to check. So somewhere that's safe and it's within your comfort level, like, for instance, like a public park that has a path in it. We definitely are not trying to get people to go anywhere beyond their comfort level. And then so once you get to these locations on the ground, you would survey for Spider-Lanternfly and Tree of Heaven. So SLF, of course, likes rusty metal, like Tom mentioned, and also Tree of Heaven trunks. And really any flat surface, especially if it has a little bit of a shelter component, like those ribs on those metal surfaces that Tom was showing. And then for Tree of Heaven, those especially like disturbed areas. And then you would use the iMapInvasives to report. You'd probably be using the mobile app. That's the easiest way to submit some quick reports. And it would depend on whether you found Tree of Heaven and Spider-Lanternfly or you didn't. So you would report not detected or presence records for both Spider-Lanternfly and Tree of Heaven. And we also ask people to quickly enter the time searched. That's useful for instance, if you looked for Spider-Lanternfly for 1 minute and didn't find it, versus you looked for 5 minutes and didn't find it. That's very useful to kind of have that indicator of survey effort. And also, it's a great way to kind of record your efforts. So we have all these volunteers spending their time helping us monitor this high priority pest. It would be really great if we could track how much time you guys are all spending, so that we can recognize that at the end of the year. And last year, sometimes there was some difficulty in trying to get to your grid square on the ground. So we really recommend trying to look at your survey grid square before you go out and pick some locations within that, like places with landmarks or something, so that you can easily just get to that location, for instance, a trailhead or a parking lot. Because once you're on the ground, it might be hard to try to get back to this map and try to see where you are on the map. So we have found that planning at the beginning kind of makes that process easier. And so when you sign up for a grid square, you could take a screenshot or print your map to make sure you always know that location. But if you don't do that, you can always go back onto the map and find your claimed grid square. So on this Find My Claimed Grid Squares tab, you can enter in your IMAP person ID, and it pulls up your map, and you can then zoom in, zoom out, pick the base map you like. Satellite imagery, for example, makes it really clear to pick out some spots to survey and be able to find them when you're on the ground. And there is also a print icon up here. So you can print to PDF or print it from your printer so that you have a little map of where you want to go survey. And I just want to emphasize to just do your best. So it's the goal of this project is to direct surveys to the general areas where we need them most. If you're 5 meters outside of your grid square, that's really not a problem. Your record will still come into IMAP. It'll still be useful to see whether or not you found spotted lanternfly or tree of heaven. So if you're not positive whether or not you're in your grid square, don't sweat it too much. It's just the general idea of getting to that general location. And I will also note, in case it causes any confusion, this grid square map is completely separate from iMapInvasives. So you would use iMapInvasives to kind of see your records and look at the data. But the grid square map is separate. So that's on our website at nyimapinvasives.org/SLF. And as your records get confirmed, you will actually see them pop up in this map because we are drawing those in from iMapInvasives. And so I just wanted to bring up this slide again as a recap of those steps. So set up an IMAP account, select a grid square on the map, do some prep work, and then go conduct your surveys. And as a reminder, this is all laid out on nyimapinvasives.org/SLF. So you don't have to remember these steps. You can always go check. And I also mentioned the survey seasons. So I'm going to add the exact date ranges to the website too, so you don't have to write them down or remember them. But I just wanted to put them up here to show them one more time. So we've got 3 or 4 weeks in the spring season. So I encourage everyone to go out and get your first round of surveys in. And then there will be more seasons throughout the summer and fall. And again, this page is a resource to kind of go through all the steps. And also, you can email us when you need help or you have a question. And also, if you sign up for the Grid Square effort, we do send out reminder emails about once a month or sometimes once every other month. So you'll hear some tips and advice that way as well. And so that was all the content of this webinar. So you learned about Tree of Heaven and Spotted Lanternfly and IMapInvasives, how to participate. And so now I just have some wrap up, and then I saw that there are a couple questions that we'll go through. So hopefully you're all ready for some detective work. Those egg masses are very tricky, but Tom gave a bunch of tips on how you can kind of tease those out if you're looking hard enough. So I think it's a lot of fun to go out and kind of try to look in detail at what's going on around you and see if there's any egg masses or other invasive species. And these are some take-home messages we had from last year. So Tom's was one of his take-home messages that he mentioned as well. So a negative survey is good. We love to see those not detected records. Our invasive species biologist at NYHP, Jennifer Dean, her take-home message from last year was before heading out and doing your survey, review your grid square to find some spots that are safely and publicly accessible for you. And then my take-home message is to submit and upload a fake species record before you go out in the field to make sure you have a handle on the reporting tools. And I also just wanted to give a brief shout out to all of the PRISMs. These are partnerships for regional invasive species management. They coordinate all sorts of management, survey, and education efforts in each of their regions. So I encourage you to take a look at this map and kind of see which PRISM you fall in, and then look them up. And there's a lot of useful information on their website, and they often hold events. And I also wanted to give a quick plug to New York Invasive Species Awareness Week, which is coming up very soon. And for the first time, we are doing a week-long NYSAW, or New York Invasive Species Awareness Week, mapping challenge, where general public and volunteers are encouraged to report to Imap to be in the running for some prizes from the DEC. So the statewide focal species will be spotted lanternfly, and each prism also selected one additional species. I won't go through all of them, but there were 3 prisms that actually chose tree of heaven. So if you're sort of from the central and western and northwestern side of the state, your species will be tree of heaven. So for any volunteers in this grid square project, if you get some of your surveys done during NYSAW, you'll be in the running for a prize from DEC. So I encourage you all to stay tuned for more information on that. You can follow us on social media or look at the NYSAW webpage, which will be more information about this challenge will be added there. And with that, just thank you so much to everyone for sticking with us. I know it was a little bit long, an hour and 20 minutes, but we thank you so much for sticking with us and learning about the species and the reporting tools. This is a really great effort that we've had going, and we're really happy to have continued participation this year. So I'll just thank everyone and wish you all good luck on your surveys. I encourage you to claim your grid square while it's fresh in your minds. And with that, I will open up the Q&A. And okay, so I'll go through one question that I can answer first, and then we've got 2 questions for Tom. So Janine asked, how often should the grid square be surveyed? So I'll just go back to that seasons page. So the goal is to survey once within each of these seasons. So that would be 4 times throughout this year. But again, it is totally fine if I know many people will miss a season, and that's totally fine. Just the goal is to get people out multiple times throughout the year. So 3 or 4 of these seasons would be how often to survey.
But more is okay.
Yeah, you could go out all the time if you want to. And then I see 2 questions for Tom. So one is, if we find spotted lanternfly, should we take measures to destroy them?
Depends on where you are. If you are in an area like, if I don't know if Mitch can back up to the map, but if you're in one of the areas where we know it exists, like say New York City or Long Island or the Lower Hudson Valley, we don't need to preserve a specimen. But if it's in a new area, we want to confirm that record. We would actually go out and collect a specimen if it's a very new location. So the short answer is it depends. So the best thing to do would be to take a photo, collect the insect. If you collect it, putting it in either hand sanitizer or rubbing alcohol is best. You can put it in a plastic container, like say an empty water bottle or something like that, and freeze it. That'll kill the insect as well. But the best thing to do is, take a photograph and report it, and then we can try to follow up from there. Because it may not be spotted lanternfly, although these are relatively easy to identify in the field. So we have not had very many false reports or lookalikes reported as spotted lanternfly, thankfully, unlike some other insects. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. The top priority thing is to take a photo and report it, and then Ag and Markets or other staff can follow up and confirm it and take whatever action is deemed necessary. And then the other question for you, Tom, is, do you recommend removing Tree of Heaven?
No, not necessarily. Early on, the strategy was to possibly remove some tree of heaven to when it was thought that tree of heaven was required for it to complete its life cycle. But considering that Spider-Lanternfly can complete its life cycle elsewhere, it's really not best to do that. You can maybe thin the herd a little bit. If you're going to eliminate them, eliminate the females, leave a couple males standing, and you can use those as trap trees for monitoring, for setting up insect traps for survey purposes. There are so many tree of heaven, and it's not cost effective to remove all those tree of heaven. Also, that you run the risk of dispersing them. So if they are the adults, especially nymphs as well, but especially the adults. If you start removing the ailanthus trees, they'll just disperse from those ailanthus trees to other suitable locations. So it's not really recommended. It's not. I can't say don't absolutely do it. I mean, there are some cases where you could thin some of the females, but it's not very cost effective, and you run the risk of accidental dispersal, and you also you might slow it down, but you're not going to stop it because it can just move on to maples or walnuts or something like that where it can complete its life cycle.
Great, thanks, Tom. And I see one more question that just came in the chat. So the question is, if we find Spider-Lanternfly on Long Island, how do we destroy them?
Well, it depends on where you are on Long Island. On Long Island, the only place that we know currently, there's a few places on the south shore of Nassau County, but the primary locations are the Farmingdale, Melville area. There's a pretty heavy infestation there, and then also in Bohemia, right near MacArthur Airport. If you're not in one of those two areas, don't destroy them. Report them to us so we can confirm that new location. If you are in one of those locations, still report them, but they can be destroyed by either crushing them, if you see it, squish it kind of thing. But you can also put them in rubbing alcohol or hand sanitizer that will also kill them. Depends on the volume. And there are sprays that are approved, chemical treatments that are approved in New York State. And I would direct you to the IPM, the Cornell IPM site for Spider-Lanternfly for the list of current pesticides that are approved. And Long Island's a little tricky as far as pesticides go because of the aquifer situation there. So some things that may be registered for other parts of the state might not be registered for use on Long Island. So please keep that in mind.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Sorry, I had mentioned it in the chat while you were talking. You were talking about being safe and comfortable with your survey location as far as the trailheads and parking areas, rather than going deep into the forest where there's no landmarks. Another reason to do that is you're more likely to find tree of heaven and Spider-Lanternfly in those disturbed areas, at the parking areas, at the trailheads, because those are the areas where traffic is coming in and out, and possible introductions can occur, and then disturbed soils for tree of heaven. So the parking areas and trailheads are really the prime locations in some of these park woodland areas. Don't be overwhelmed because there's 15,000 acres in this grid. Trailhead is a perfect spot to start.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, Tom. And so I don't see any more questions, and it looks like we're at the end of our time block. So I'm going to give one last thank you to Tom for presenting to us, and also to our current and past volunteers and all of our attendees here today. We hope you participate this year, and we hope you have fun going out there and helping us monitor this invasive pest. So thanks so much, everyone.
And thanks to you, Mitch. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom.